Welcome, everybody. It's my great pleasure and honour to welcome you to our session today. We have two incredible presenters. Great, and they'll be jumping on the camera any second now. I'll just begin by introducing Jane Davidson, who I had the great privilege of meeting several years ago through my work as the director and lead faculty of Harvard's Executive Education for Sustainability Leadership program. Jane, as many of you may already know, is the author of Future Gen, Lessons from a Small Country, which is a story of why and how Wales became the first country in the world to introduce legislation that actually strives to protect future generations. What a concept. You wonder why no one else has been doing this. She has an amazing career journey, which I won't dive into here. I'm going to pass over to Jane to ask her to tell us a little more about that journey and what brings her here into this session with all of us today. But just footnotes here. She was the Minister for Education, then the Minister for Environment Sustainability in the Welsh Government. She currently still is the Pro-Vice Chancellor Emeritus at the University of Wales, Trinity St David. So Jane, I'll just pass over to you for a few more minutes, if you will, on your background, and then I'll introduce Lyla June as well.
Oh, hi Leith, and hi Lila, and thank you so much to the conference for asking us to do this session today. Yes, 10 years ago, when I was still a politician, I proposed what is now the WellBeing of Future Generations Act, because Wales had been on a journey for a decade before that on trying to factor sustainable development into all its decision making. And I think it'd be fair to say it was a rocky journey. Everybody supported the idea. The idea is not contentious, but how you deliver it. And unless you've got a very, very clear focus on what you want to achieve, and also a clear focus on how you want to achieve it, it's actually really tricky to bring people to the table, whether that's politicians or whether or not that's the civil service, or indeed the electorate, the people of Wales. And so I thought it was really important that we actually defined in Wales, what sustainable development looked like and how it should be delivered. And I proposed that. I left politics, and 5 years later, the National Assembly for Wales, as it was at that time, the elected members there passed the WellBeing of Future Generations Act. And as Leith said, it's the first in the world that factors future generations into policy thinking. And just for the purposes of this session, I just wanted to very quickly give you the core elements of it, although in the chat we're posting a link so that people will be able to look at it for themselves. But essentially the Act has 7 goals, which are about being prosperous, resilient, healthier, equal, cohesive, globally responsible, and a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language. But what the Act does is it defines those goals in law. And by defining those goals, the definition of a prosperous Wales is innovative, productive, and low carbon, recognising the limits of the global environment, acting on climate change. And a resilient Wales maintains and enhances a biodiverse natural environment. All these goals completely change the paradigm in terms of what is business as usual. It means that now mining and fracking and all those things which have been very visible in terms of campaigns against them in the context of this conference, you cannot take a high carbon activity and deliver it in Wales if it is in the Government of Wales' responsibility to stop it. And the other key element of this is that the 5 ways of working, the mechanism to make it happen, they're also in the Act. So having to think long term, having to be preventative, having to collaborate with each others, having to evolve people about whom decisions are made, having to integrate outcomes, they're all there in the Act. They're required to deliver. They fit with the Sustainable Development Goals. And that means that Wales now is not only the only country in the world to have a piece of legislation to do that. Now what we're finding is that the people of Wales really want the government, the political parties of Wales to use this legislation and totally change the paradigms. And I'm delighted today that we'll be able to talk particularly in the context of food and farming and how we create much healthier opportunities for the future as a result of being a country with a WellBeing of Future Generations Act. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. And let me now also through Jane, we're really lucky to have with us Lyla June. Lyla June is an Indigenous musician, scholar, community organiser, and I would say aspiring state legislative member who I'm particularly so inspired by this convergence in her work, leading up to running for state legislature, state office in 2020 in the state of New Mexico, which became a driving force for her to work with her community members, local knowledge experts to generate a 7-point plan. And through this grassroots, highly collaborative process developed the 7 Generations New Deal, which is where this convergence of Jane and Lila have really come alive in our panel session today. Lila is, as I said, an Indigenous musician, scholar, and community organizer with lineage to the Diné or Navajo, Cheyenne, and European lineages. And she blends studies in human ecology at Stanford University, graduate work in Indigenous pedagogy, the traditional or sort of dominant worldview in the US. She blends all of these together to help create bridges to new perspectives and solutions. She's currently pursuing her doctoral degree focusing on Indigenous food systems revitalization. Lila, over to you to kick us off, telling us a bit about your journey and what brings you into this session today.
Yes, thank you so much, dear. So I'll introduce myself in my native language first, just to honor my ancestors. We say which means hello, where the sky meets earth, my relatives and my people. Taos, New Mexico, so those are my 4 clans. We have a clan system, and we always speak those clans before we speak to honor our ancestors. And I got my clan from my mother, which is the Black Charcoal Streak Division of the Red Running Into Water clan of the Diné Nation. We are also incorrectly known as Navajo sometimes. We're indigenous to what is now called Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And I'm very honored to be here. I'm really grateful to speak alongside Jane, and thank you so much, Leith. But essentially, I ran for office earlier last year. This time last year, things were really ramping up. I was doing a 7-day fast on the Capitol steps to pray for the next 7 generations to come. And through an extensive consultation process with both Indigenous scientists and Western scientists, we developed the 7 Generations New Deal, which was a 7-point plan that also had actionable policy items in every point, so that it wasn't just principles and values, but actually like, how do we operationalize this? That's something that we were sort of finding wasn't present in the Green New Deal presented by congressional leaders in Washington, D.C. So this actually had hard steps that we could take. So just very briefly, I won't get into it too much. And there's a part in here that's very connected to food and my doctoral research, so I'll get into that, of course. But basically, one of the first points is to take money out of politics. American politics is very much influenced by the corporate world, and that is, until we address that and Citizens United, which allows them to affect policy, we're never going to get out of the oil oligarchy. You know, the fact that oil industries essentially run the U.S. government and other governments too. The second is Indigenous science, integrating Indigenous science and into our policies and setting out task force to collect that knowledge and start integrating them into our policies. The third is a structurally shifted green economy. In other words, not just having solar panels, but who owns the solar panels, and restoring horizontal ownership structures, co-ops, et cetera, to these renewable energy grids that are coming in. The fourth was ecological restoration, which includes holding fracking companies liable. New Mexico is home to one of the largest fracking fields in the world right now, one of the largest oil producers in the world right now. And so we are really looking at several legal tools to hold the fracking companies accountable as they try to dodge accountability for cleanup. The fifth is equity, ensuring that no one group is sacrificed for the well-being of another, especially along the lines of race, gender, and ethnic origin. The sixth is climate education, in instituting a climate curriculum into the schools such that people are informed. And the seventh is systems change, really looking at reframing our whole understanding of systems, instituting legal rights for nature, incorporating the true costs of fossil fuels into state and federal budgets, rearranging subsidies to close the wealth disparity, on and on and on. So that's just a little taste of what the 7 Generations New Deal is about. And we will put it in the chat, the whole website. This is meant to be shared. This is meant to be used across municipal, state, and federal governments. So please feel free to plagiarize this. That's what it's for, if it's at all useful. Obviously, I'm working in the American context. We call it Turtle Island, but we have a lot of Indigenous peoples who have been ripped off. And obviously, this is very unique to this context, so it might not be completely applicable to other contexts, but there are Indigenous peoples everywhere, and their science and their knowledge is important to introduce into our policies at this time. So thank you so much. That's sort of my little spiel on how I got into politics, and I never thought I would have, ever, but they just begged me to, so I finally said yes.
Well, gosh, thank you. It gives a lot of us hope to see this kind of vision and commitment and this paradigm changing enterprise that you're on. And I think this is what connects you and Jane in your work is this paradigm change that you're both striving to bring to life by detailing out and anchoring us in structural reform that is action-oriented. I want to just now open the door for both of you to take us further on this journey, specifically into land, or what Indigenous people in Australia would call country, and food. Can you both now take the floor again and share with us how does the wider paradigm level change and vision that both of you have touched on in your work with Future Gen and the 7 Generations New Deal, take us down to that next level of specifically food and land?
I think one of the things that really struck me and why I was so keen to work with Lyla June on this panel was that actually, if you look at the content of her 7-step plan, it's incredibly similar to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in terms of the areas that are important. And both of them look at issues around climate. They look at issues around equity. They look at issues around systems reform. And what has really excited me in Wales, and I hope it will excite other people on the call, is that this has scared the government. You know, they may have passed this legislation themselves, but actually the kind of like the ramifications of being the first country in the world responsible for looking after future generations is actually a really scary political system challenge. And I think what's been amazing is it's now the people of Wales that are kind of stepping up and saying, hey, look at this. What if we did it about food? What if we did about food in a way that where we're looking totally at agroecology? And we've had a lot of about agroecology in this conference so far. And therefore we look at the farming, we look at the skills in terms of people being able to farm in that way. We look at horticulture, and we know that in the context of Wales, we only grow about 3% of our own fruit and vegetables. And I kind of think, as somebody who's an organic smallholder myself, you know, that is extraordinary. I mean, I can pretty well survive out of what we grow on our little holding. But actually, in the context of Wales growing for its population, it's growing nowhere near enough. So we're just not thinking about the resilience and the use of our land in ways that will actually enable us to both look at local food procurement, but also bring nature into this. Think about how we can be cooperative about food. Think about how we can help create healthier food for our schools and our public services. Look at how we can actually, by promoting local food, create new opportunities for businesses and jobs. So one of the things I did accept when I left politics, and then I left the university last year, was to chair the Wales inquiry of this amazing commission, the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, which is actually focused on looking at how we could apply agroecology everywhere in the UK. And what was really exciting, and it happened at this conference yesterday, was the Commission launched a report that is supported by IDRI, which is a French-based European Research Institute, that actually bore out that the UK could be fed by farming agroecologically. And that is so exciting because, of course, one of the big challenges in these debates is actually traditional food producers saying we can't be fed if we do this. And in terms of future generations, it's not just about looking to the future, because, of course, the only reason we know we can be fed is because of the generations past, which have actually given us their wisdom, demonstrated what can be done with the land, the pioneers who've got out there and done special things. I think over to Lila at that point.
Sure. So thank you so much. Well, I think it's brilliant that we're working together on this, and Indigenous peoples of what we now call the United States, but we prefer to call Turtle Island, you know, we developed extraordinary food systems here on this land. And so the 7 Generations New Deal, which we say because the Haudenosaunee, which is a tribe from New York, what's now called New York, they talk about how everything we do, we must consider its impact on the next 7 generations to come. And that really led their policy, and it still does in many ways. And so that's why it's called 7 Generations New Deal. But the third or the fourth point in here, the second point in here is to integrate Indigenous science into our policy frameworks. So why is this important to food? Because Indigenous peoples and our sciences, if the world had the humility, and if the government had the humility to learn from our long-standing practices, we could absolutely revolutionize the way people think about food and water. We could take care of our home. We could make sure everyone's fed and then some. So let me just get into, as briefly as I can, although I've given talks on this that last up to 2 hours sometimes, and I still don't say everything I need to say. So I'll do it as briefly as I can. Indigenous food systems, generally speaking, are very different than anything any of us here could probably ever fathom. Why? Because it's very connected to regional scale land management, and it's not domesticated. It's actually about habitat expansion, which then, in a way, kind of lures our food to us. It's about in creating habitat that is conducive to life on Earth. And not just any life, but biodiverse life. This whole monoculture thing, you would not see it in Indigenous communities. According to a new UN report, although Indigenous peoples make up only about 5% of the world's population, they oversee 80% of the world's biodiversity, 80%. And this is not coincidental. Our land stewardship practices fostered biodiversity. So let me give you a concrete example. There's an island off the coast of British Columbia wherein our ancestors, and this is in Canada, Western Canada, wherein our ancestors would actually create these clam gardens on the shorelines. And they would essentially create a space along the shore where clams would proliferate. And this was a key example of habitat expansion. And so they would actually bring boulders, and 35% of the coastline of this massive island, it's a big island, has ancient pre-Columbian clam gardens built into it. And so this just goes to show one of many dozens of examples that I'm being blessed to find out in my doctoral research of ways that Indigenous peoples sculpted the way that the land looked and tasted. And this clam garden created space for sea urchins, waterfowl, all these different species. So yes, it is designed to create habitat for clams, which are delicious and nutritious, but it also created a caloric base for more than just humans. So that's also a key difference between Western food systems and Indigenous food systems. Western food systems are human-centric. They're designed to feed humans. Indigenous food systems are ecocentric. They are designed to feed the entire ecosystem. So we would feed everyone. One last example is how we would burn along the plains. This would inject nutrient-dense, rather phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium into the soil through the ash, generating nutrient-dense grasslands that would actually, who loves that but the buffalo, right? So the buffalo, we would feed the buffalo through our burning practices, which injects those nutrients, as well as charcoal, which stimulates microbial activity in the soil to create these nutrient-dense grasslands. Again, habitat expansion so that these buffalo have a place to come and eat. So we burned the entire Great Plains, and people don't like to talk about that because Indians are supposed to be too stupid to do something on that level, on that systematic level. But we're saying, no, we managed this entire continent extensively prior to Columbus's arrival. And I'm going to plug in my computer. My computer's about to die, but that's all I wanted to say on that piece is Indigenous food systems are so exciting. And I'm going to put a link in the comments that gives a deeper dive into what I'm talking about in case anyone is interested.
Yeah, thanks, Lila. Yeah, there's been some recent publishing and research in Australia that has reflected the very same revelation of getting beyond the colonial sort of ignorant lens on what was going on this continent with all of the Indigenous groups, finally realizing that the extent to which those Indigenous groups were working in flow with these ecosystems and shaping them over thousands and thousands of years to be incredibly incredible food productive ecologies that had found like a homeostasis that was highly productive and highly diverse in the life that it was supporting. I want to challenge you both around, I guess I want to lead us into this active imagination of imagining what this could look like, but also sort of teasing out why is it so hard and why aren't we there? And I want to do it by just sharing a little anecdote that came across my path actually a decade or more ago. At Yale University, when I founded Harvard's Office for Sustainability, and while I was running that, we were doing a lot to try to get our dining halls to shift over to supporting like local, small, organic And we kept running up against the business model issue of like, hey, it's more expensive, transportation, supply chain challenges, all that stuff. And we watched this interesting case study happen in one of Yale's dining halls, where Alice Waters, who's a very famous restaurateur and advocate for small, local, organic, had actually funded Yale to shift one dining hall entirely to this very different supply chain to support local small farms. And what turned out in that whole enterprise was the only way they could make the business model work was they actually reduced the diversity of choices for the students, which initially nobody thought the students would accept. They were so attached to their tater tots and like 5 different kinds of salad and 10 different kinds of protein. But what happened was the food that they did get was so utterly delicious that even though now they only had maybe 2 choices instead of 10 choices, and it also, what they did was they took away trays, because trays seemed to correlate to students putting more food on than they could actually eat. And then there was wasted food, which was also costing. So they reduced the food waste, they reduced the choice, and thereby sewed up the business model to work. And the students, who everybody thought there'll be a mutiny because they don't have all their choices and they can't carry their trays, they loved the food so much that there were students from other dining halls forging identity cards to get into this other dining hall. And so I think it goes back in a very small anecdotal way to the larger paradigm, because when you look through Future Gen and the wider, so food is nested in there, food and relationship to land is nested in there, but it's surrounded by other paradigm changes that get at behaviors around consumption and the root of happiness, and deeper sort of reflexive behaviors that come from a history of colonization and empire, and that do lack grounding in older cultures that have come to a different relationship with land. And I think what both of you get at in your bodies of work and the deep collaborations is that you can't pick one issue like food and not address the broader cultural paradigm that's around it. Otherwise, you get pinned in by the business model dilemmas. So this, I think, leads us to a question of, share with us, like, I guess through the lens of imagination or perhaps intellect, why is it so hard? And can you take us maybe in your own journey of imagining what would it be like when we arrive in this new place, or perhaps this old place coming into a new time? What's that going to be like for us? An act of imagination.
I think one of the most sort of difficult things I found when we started on the journey around wanting to create decisions that were sustainable. I mean, you said at the outcome, Leith, that I was the Minister for Education, and as Minister for Education, I had a real opportunity because I was in charge of free school meals. And therefore, I was also in charge of the content of the meals. And I created actually free school breakfasts, healthy breakfasts for primary school pupils, universal provision. I got very much attacked politically by my opponents for that, because they felt the family should look after children. But I wanted to make sure that all children had a healthy breakfast before they came into the classroom. And what was absolutely fascinating was one of the biggest problems to me then, and we're talking back in the early 2000s, was procurement. And procurement became a really dirty word in my book. Now, I don't know whether that's a word that, conjures up the same kind of horrendous red tape issues for either of you. But for us, it meant that through procurement, you were tapped into and tied into systems that you could not change, potentially for 5 years or so. And in actual fact, I mean, literally just before I left the university last year, I was able to get traction behind a procurement project in one of the counties in Wales, in Carmarthenshire, because everybody understood the problem. But what I was looking for was whether or not the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act could help provide the solution. And if all the procurement professionals of all the public services got together, so that was hospitals and schools and universities and local authorities, all different ones, police, they all got together and agreed to procure together healthy, sustainable, locally grown food, then they would not only be able to have a completely different offer in their setting, but also they'd create new businesses. And they've really gone for it. But oddly enough, we said that 10 years ago and there was no traction. But having a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act means that people can suddenly see the opportunity. So I think that, just as Lila needs to just, get that manifesto out there, get that 7-point plan for future generations out there, because these are the sort of propositions, these are the value systems that if people get behind these, they lead you into different kinds of behaviors. And I think that therefore for me, what was kind of like a business nagging problem has now become one of the biggest windows of opportunity, because every single aspect of business engaging with the public sector is through a procurement mechanism. So if you apply a different values framework, you can change everything as a result of it. And that's why I'm so excited that food will actually be at heart of a new revolution in Wales. And if it turns out that food and land use, and just to say one other quick thing about that, one of the other things I was able to introduce as minister were called One Planet developments. And that was the idea that if a farmer was prepared to let somebody have some land to actually experiment with living sustainably, if they were prepared to build a zero carbon house, and if they could get half their income off the land, I created a new planning opportunity in Wales through our planning system, whereby people could build houses in places which normally you wouldn't be able to build houses. So you got that benefit, but only if you demonstrated you could live a low carbon life. And we've got 45 of these settings now, and the first planned eco village in the UK. And what it's just getting so exciting again is there are loads more people starting to apply, because they're seeing different ways you could use the land ecologically, and that is the heart of their proposition. So we've got to get this idea that ecology first, ecology before economy, and that takes us straight back into the idea of Indigenous wisdom.
It's funny. Indigenous food systems are actually incredibly more efficient, economically speaking.
Yeah.
There's just less control, for one thing, because it's not about control. And I think humans crave control if we're conditioned to do so, which we are. And there's also, again, ecocentricity, that we are actually putting the whole at the center. And so that is very hard for a capitalist to wrap his or her mind around. Is like, how do I not only maximize profits for myself? I've been trained to do that since I was a little boy or girl. When I was taking economics classes at Stanford, I was like, how is this the most prestigious university in the country when they are teaching this from the stage of the economics class? He said the foundational assumptions of economics is there's not enough and everyone will be acting for themselves. And I was like, no wonder we're screwed, because this is truly the foundational assumption of modern economics. And for Indigenous peoples, it's the opposite. There's more than enough and everyone will be acting in the name of something bigger than themselves. And when that is the core, the foundational assumptions and praxis of a society, wealth is naturally what follows. And when I say wealth, I mean wealth for everyone and everything. And I also mean wealth, not just physically, but spiritual and emotional as well. And so anyways, my point is there shouldn't be, we shouldn't run up against any business model walls, because it's actually more efficient. Indigenous food systems are actually more efficient in terms of the input and the output. What you put in is minimal compared to what you get out. And of course, perhaps most importantly, but perhaps most challenging for people to wrap their heads around, is what you get back is longitudinal. It's not going to go away in 50 years or what the way that we're operating now. It's like, as long as we get something tomorrow, who cares if our children have anything left? So I just think it's fascinating how we shouldn't be butting up against any business models, because this is actually one of the most economically inefficient. When I talk about a carbon-based capitalistic economy, it's the most inefficient thing you could ever dream up. And they do all these cute little models that make it seem efficient in the moment, right? But longitudinally, it is not. And also, even in the moment, it's not. When you take into account these indigenous food systems, where, interestingly, what you put in, or rather, let me rephrase that. In a European or Eurocentric capitalistic economic framework, in order to get, you have to take. You have to take from the system in order to get. But in an indigenous framework, you can get by giving, and you can get without taking anything from the system. If there's 100 calories in the system, you can actually take in ways that do not take away from those initial calories. You can actually expand the amount of calories that are possible, such as those clam gardens, and that's your input, and the output is so much more for you and all of biodiversity. So that's a little bit of a long-winded way of saying, you know, with indigenous food systems, we should not have to butt up against economic issues, because they're actually some of the most incredibly efficient in that I've seen so far.
I think you've both, in a way, touched on a connected issue again of the organization, that the way that humans then organize together in relationship with food production or food curation. And so I was wondering if you tell me, or tell all of us, or share any other thoughts that you have on that, because I know that in each of the your bodies of work, from the 7 Generations New Deal and in Future Gen, they're again back to this point of, well, when you try to transform food in isolation of other facets of this broader paradigm change, then you hit dead ends pretty quickly. But when you are transforming food, as you transform from mindsets of control to mindsets of cooperation, or a mindset of lack to a mindset of abundance, you know, that the mindset shift that has to come with it, in a more concrete way, I'm wondering if you could share thoughts about how does a different relationship with food require a different relationship to turn up between people? I think, Lila, you touched on that by, you know, just briefly there, from a monocultural farming mindset. You're competing on a market, in a marketplace that drives down the price. So you're always being forced to go for the cheapest possible unit of production today, inheriting all sorts of costs tomorrow that will be passed on to the next generation, literally in reduced soil quality, reduced biodiversity and all that. So what is it that has to change in the human relationships, the relationships between the people on the land, working the land, the people in the community that are distributing food and caring for the people that are actually doing the hands-on work on the land with the food? Can you both share and connect back to your bodies of work on that part of the transformation as well?
Yeah, perhaps I'll put a link in the chat now, because I just think there's quite interesting, a particular project that has happened in Wales, which has been supported by WWF Cymru. So that's a very locally based office of WWF, and they worked with Cardiff University on a Welsh food system fit for future generations. And what was so extraordinary when they produced it, and they only produced it a few months ago, is nobody's ever in my political life talked about a Welsh food system before. And so it was kind of like, you know, sort of, because in a sense, you know, Wales is only very, very small. I mean, it's 3 million population, about 10 million sheep. You know, we're really good at growing grass because we're over in the west and we get a lot of rain. But our farmers generally farm sheep and cattle. You know, that is the primary, the kind of primary farming in Wales. So the food system for most people has been your local supermarket, and what you eat has been guided by availability in the supermarket. And it just was so extraordinary to me to find that we grew so little of our own fruit and vegetables, and that actually, you know, even from a governmental perspective, and I'm as guilty as any of having been in government and not seen the connection at the time, was that we've thought of food either as an economy element, i.e., you know, selling Welsh cheese, Caerphilly cheese and others to the world, or we thought of food as a sort of health element, you know, dietary element, or a farm element. But what we didn't do was join it up. And I think that the biggest imaginative opportunity here is if we join it up so that we can get the climate benefit, we can get the health benefit, we can get the nature benefit, then actually this is about creating cohesive communities. For us in Wales, you know, with one of the oldest languages in the world, the language of Welsh, it is also about sustaining those Welsh-speaking communities too. It is about how we relate to the world. So oddly enough, those things which actually are right at the heart of humans staying alive are the things that often government forgets. And now we have to think about, in this climate crisis, we've got to get back to the things that keep humans alive, but keep ecology alive, all the other beings on this planet alive as well. And that has been a link that has been lost. And I'm not sure yet enough people are calling for it to be regained. We hear some people in some places, but this is universal. You'd have thought that human self-interest would have helped us make this link earlier, because all our survivals depend on it.
Thank you so much, Jane. Yeah, I think the relationships between people and all of that is really fundamental to Indigenous communities. One of our most important words in our language is ke, K''E, ke. And what that means is kinship, interdependence, community, being there for each other, love and compassion, all of that wrapped up into that one little syllable. And ke is really the guiding principle through which we operate. It is not always easy, but at least that is an ethic. At least that is the foundational principle of our economic system. And you'll find that across the board with Indigenous groups in Turtle Island, everywhere from, you know, First Nations groups in British Columbia across to the Plains tribes, to the tribes in the Southeast, in Alabama and Florida, to the tribes in the Southwest. We all almost universally have this ethic of community and being there for each other. And we used to have a competition. We still do, but used to be more so when there were more of us. 98% of us were wiped out by colonization. And the competition was who could be the most humble, who could be the most generous, who could be the most kind. And it was somewhat of an unspoken competition, but it truly governed a lot of behavior. And so you would never see someone out there maximizing profits. We actually saw that as a mental illness. When we saw them doing that, we could not wrap our heads around, like, why? But I also want to acknowledge that we had that luxury of being born into a culture where those frameworks were already set up. Now we are born into cultures where the opposing frameworks are all around us. And I think that's sort of the question, maybe what you're getting at with your question is, I mean, how do we break through these overarching paradigms and frameworks that are making these, I've seen in the questions, you know, this is a no-brainer, this is so easy, you know, that make all of these seemingly elementary things so challenging is the overarching oppressive, truly, frameworks that make it hard for a politician like yourself, Jane, to do the simple things that should have been simple, but surely we're not. I applaud you for all you've done, by the way. I did not get elected as you did, but I may try again in the future. But I sure tried to get elected. In any case, I guess I just wanted to share those little tidbits of Indigenous knowledge, because whenever I go around and share these things, like, you know, it just blows open the horizons, and people see, oh, it's kind of like when Norway or different countries in Europe give all of their students free tuition. And then America's like, hey, how come they get that and we don't, you know? So sometimes if I say like, is the foundational principle of Indigenous economies, everyone's like, hey, why can't we have that? You know? And so the answer is we can. We just need to continue to refine the way we communicate these things to this world. And lastly, I'll just end by saying models, you know, models that work. That's why, Jane, you are so powerful, because you haven't just said it, you have done it. And that's often when people really start getting invested. They say they tried it and it worked. And so even if it's a small model, I implore all of us to continue to build those models that seem so out of the box and beyond what the realm of possibility is for most people. But then again, boom, there it is, it exists. And that opens people up in a deeper way than just talking about it.
Wow. So as you both see, there are questions feeding into the chat room now. Several of them revolve around people wanting to take agency and wanting some extra tips on how to pull this off, how to bring to life this type of legislative transformation. And I think, of course, we would say there's a book now, isn't there? Future Jen. Jane's got the book out. So definitely reading that book. And then Lila's, the link to the 7 Generations New Deal there might also feed in to some additional resources in there. But we have these 2 incredible people here now. So why don't we ask them in real time, look, if you were to give people that are listening in, say 1 to 3 key tips on if they want to take agency on this, they want to see this kind of transformation, perhaps at the legislative level, or perhaps they want to just get out and get their community growing and connecting to food systems differently. What are 1 to 3 tips or offerings that each of you would like to speak to these good people on this call, on this session right now?
Gosh.
Other than reading the book, right? Because there's like many.
Of course, I do hope some people will read the book. There it is. That's it. That's the last advert. But actually, I think I've been asked this a lot since I wrote the book about why did I propose this? And I think it was born out of frustration that the things that in the chat box, the things that Lila and you, Leith, have been saying today, we all think this is common sense. But there are still so many people in the world who either have bought into an alternative, extractive at all costs vision, or who are victims of that vision and find it really hard to lift their head up and hope in terms of being able to take other ways forward. And I want to go back to Donella Meadows for my main tip, because I think it's, you read something sometimes and you realize that that person has encapsulated a thought that you just didn't know how to say. And what I love about Professor Donella Meadows, Dana, as she's more commonly called, is that she talks about 3 ways of looking at the world. You know, people who think the world is just there to extract, and that therefore they will extract as much as possible, and they will not worry about the consequences, because, and that's the oligarchs, isn't it? It's the people who just believe. And when it's tied as much into political systems as it is in some countries, less in the UK because the oil belongs to Scotland here. So it's but you know, when it's tied into political systems, it becomes much harder to move. But then she also talks about those people who, you know, understand that the world is in peril, but they still try and extract as much as they can before the barrier goes up in some way to stop the action. And then the third group of people are those who understand we're in peril and have enough belief in the human race, have enough belief that there is enough love, enough common sense, and enough support across the world for us to create a different way forward. And I just remember reading that, and she wrote it in, I think, in the 1970s. And I put it in my book, in the last chapter of my book, because I feel it's as true today. The evidence is there. We have to act. We can see global systems failing around us, and we have to find our little part in it. So for me, it's, if you read something that motivates you, act on it, and don't take no for an answer. And I realize that the only reason that I'm sitting in this studio today is because I was never prepared to give up on the idea that we really should have law and policy to look after future generations. And it's only looking back I can see that's what I was doing, because life is not convenient in the sense of how you get there. But when I look back, I realize the people who influence me to behave the way I've behaved, to live the life I live, to try and live as low carbon a life in this world, and also therefore to draw others in, and not to give up on a key idea. And so all those people in the chat who want to start something, start it. And whatever you want to start, more than anything else, start that. Because the trouble is, if we get diverted onto smaller areas of things, then we just feel we can't get an outcome. So find the thing that really motivates you and just go for it. And you will be called belligerent, arrogant, aggressive, all those things. And yeah, just be all those things for something you believe in.
I would echo that. I want to share a story, as many of my people share lessons through stories. I recently visited a group of Muskogee Native people here in Alabama, and they have actually purchased 700 acres to create their own Muskogee language immersion eco-village. So they have actually created a space where only Muskogee is spoken, and they have only a few speakers left on the planet of this endangered language, and the only children who speak the language on the planet live there. And so they are working to revive their language, and they have a beautiful space. And so anyways, I walked into this space, and I just thought to myself, wow, I've never actually been in a place where I could simply be Indigenous, and everything around me reinforced that Indigenous culture. Because even on our reservations, you know, the US government put us all on these tiny reservations. Even though those are our communities, they're still so insulated by tribal government and federal agencies and all of the pain and the history of how we even got there in the first place. And it feels like a caricature of our ancestral selves, or even a mock federal version of it. And so to go there and to feel that I was in an Indigenous space, controlled by Indigenous people, owned by Indigenous hands, and to see the beautiful things they were doing, sturgeon, what do they call it? Hydroponic systems, bringing the buffalo back, having beautiful structures that they built with only wood gathered on site, and not just crappy structures, but really fine, beautiful structures. It just showed me that what happens when you are arrogant, belligerent, and crazy. Because these people, it's not supposed to be possible for Native Americans to do that. You're not supposed to be able to raise enough money to buy that land. So I would just echo what Jane said, is I wish all of you could have an experience like that, because what it taught me was, just because you haven't seen it and nobody else has seen it before, absolutely does not mean it's not possible. And I think I did think that for some reason. Before I went there, I thought, oh, it's just too hard. No one's ever done it before. Because what he's doing is what every Native American wants to do. We want to save our language. We want to feed our people sustainably. And we want to have autonomy. And we just think it's impossible. Oh, no one's ever done it. But he's just like, boom, did it. You can do it. And so I think I would just echo what Jane says. If you see a vision, just do it. I know that's a little harder to do than to say, but and if you fail, that's okay. That's okay, because you learn through the failures, and your vision might refine as you go along, because you're going to learn new things as you go along. But and that was the main goal of my whole political campaign. No one had ever run in a way I had run before. No one had ever said the things I had said as a political candidate before. But I said, let's chart this unlit path together. Let's go where nobody's gone together. Let's practice. And okay, we might stumble. We might fall on our face. But you know what? Let's do it anyways, because it's in falling and failing that we give more lessons to our descendants to learn from.
Yeah, I something that you said, Lila, when we had our prep call, that really struck me is the indigeneity that sits behind the Welsh culture, and the way you called out, like, your culture has as much of an Indigenous lineage as our cultures do in the Native American arena. And there's something so powerful about connecting back to that indigeneity. And I guess a good colleague of mine, Matt Lynch, says that, all of our ancestors were Indigenous at some point in some place. And some of us are many generations removed from that indigeneity, and some of us are more closely anchored to it still. There's an opportunity for all of us to reconnect to the deep wisdom and those ways of knowing that had come from an Indigenous relationship to land, to food, to governance, to the way that we related to the flow of life itself. And I think this panel is so important, because it's saying to all of us that, and in particular, you, Lila, being present in the US when it's going through all this mayhem and the world's sort of watching on, and there's such a tendency towards despair and confusion and disorientation. And yet, in a way, what it's doing and what it's serving is waking us up to looking to different sources of guidance and different places for leadership. And I think this place of tapping into Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous forms of leadership, Indigenous methods of connecting to land and culture, this is fast becoming, in my mind, the most important waterhole to go to drink from in these days. And I just wanted to throw that line out there to each of you as we sort of round the corner here. In these times, why connect to Indigenous wisdom?
I'll go ahead and go. I learned that the Welsh had their language prohibited as late as the 1930s, perhaps even beyond, where the children would get a block of wood tied around their neck that said WN written on it if they were caught speaking Welsh, which stood for Welsh not. And the only way they could get off their neck is if they caught another person speaking Welsh. And I said, gee, that sounds very familiar to what my people went through. Very, very, very familiar. And then I learned about the witches, the destruction of the women and the keepers of the knowledge. And I said, that sounds very familiar too. Because when the US would come into our communities, they would systematically rape our women. And that was not just designed to hurt the women. That was designed to hurt the men who loved them, right? Because if you are somehow unable to protect your wife, daughter, sister, I mean, that eats a man alive in ways that it shouldn't, but it does. And in terms of it, he shouldn't think it's his fault or that he's a bad protector, but he still sometimes thinks that. And so I just see so many parallels between Wales and Dene Nation, so many, in the ways we were treated, in the knowledge that we carry, in the spirituality and the connection to the earth and to the bluestone. You know, I love the bluestone. I went to Wales and I got a big bluestone. I probably wasn't supposed to bring it back, but I did. Very just precious to me. So I think what you're saying, indigeneity, you know, connecting, rooting into that. Yes, I mean, I might be biased, but I think that has been the case all along, that it has been our task for the past 500 years, for the past 2,000, 3,000 years. And yet we keep pretending like this colonial empire-based way of life makes sense. And you either get on the ship and become a conqueror, or you're left in the dust. And those are the only options we've been given for a long time, which are false options. And so the thing of it is that we haven't, as Indigenous peoples, had a chance to share our knowledge because the dominant system was still functioning, albeit short-lived, but it was still functioning. So they didn't think that they needed help. Now it is collapsing from every angle, ecologically, politically, socially, gender. Everything is breaking down in the United States, at least, across the board. And globally, that capitalistic culture that has been exported to other places, it is not working, and people can finally admit that, right? And so now the world is more ready for Indigenous knowledge. And I think, sadly, I don't mean to say this as an absolute statement, but it seems that oftentimes people are not ready for change until they hit rock bottom. And I'm afraid to say we are either there or fast approaching. And so now everyone's like, excuse me, Native Americans, what were you saying about that? How does that work again? Now we're able to, in full force, come out and share.
Yeah, new ears. It's an incredible time. We have been gifted an extra 15 minutes, but there's a catch, everybody. We have to jump over to a Zoom link that has turned up in your chat room. Jane and Lila have kindly agreed to extend their time on this session for that extra 15 minutes. We're going to jump in there now. We're actually a few minutes late leaving this space. So literally, we'll just do a quick 10-second goodbye from the panel for those of you that don't want to do the jump to Zoom. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And I have loved this panel so much. Thank you, Lila and Jane.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say, I talked about lessons from a small country. I actually think it's actually lessons from small nations.
Nice.
Yes, ma'am. Nice. Thank you all so much. Have a great day. Appreciate it.
Right. Bye.
Check out the Zoom link on chat, and we'll be there in a small moment.